Yeah.
So she will get us started.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm very excited to have this panel here. My name is Shady Rose. I'm the events manager here at Lost City Books. Thank you all for coming. I'll tell you a little bit about us before we get started. We are a used, new, and rare bookstore curated by what I think are some of the coolest kids in DC. So as you have a chance after this panel, you can take a look around and see what we have that we've carefully chosen for lovely folks like you. Also, you can check the table in the back. We selected some recommended reading on climate activism and a few memoirs and related things. So take a look at those as well. Without further ado, I'd like to start with just a few housekeeping things. Please silence your cell phones during the panel so that we can show our respect to our wonderful panelists tonight. There will be an opportunity for you all to engage in a Q&A at some point, right? So if you have questions or comments you'd like to share, please hold those until the appropriate time. Lastly, this is being live streamed on our YouTube page. So if you do have a question or a comment that you want to share, you won't be visible, but your voice and your question will end up on the live stream, just so you know. Also, for those of you watching from home, if you have a question that you'd like to add, you can type it into the chat and we'll share it later. Without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Anne.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. My name is Anne. I'm part of Climate Classes, and we're so happy to have you here for our first event of 2020, Sink or Swim, How the DMV area can adapt to climate change. Climate Class in the fight against climate change by providing civic education programming and to help build and strengthen our communities and individuals within those communities to take action against climate change. We believe that we can make a difference by empowering all individuals and learning and sharing sustainable life skills, and by understanding the root causes and effects of climate-based issues from multiple perspectives. So tonight we're going to hear from our panelists about the direct and societal impacts of climate change in the DMV area. The discussion is going to touch upon climate privilege and how our communities can work towards equitable solutions for climate change. So we're honored to have with us Selma Khalil of the DC chapter of the Sunrise Movement, Sarah Kugel-Smucker from the DC Department of Energy and the Environment,
DCOPC, the Office of People's Council.
I mixed you up. I'm so sorry.
Okay, we're next to each other.
Yes. So then this is Jen Hatch.
No,
Sorry.
Sorry, I'm Jen. This is Sarah. She works for OPC though, and I work for DMV.
You're
good.
I'm so sorry.
There's not gonna be a quiz.
You're okay.
No quizzes
You're
on
okay.
this.
Don't worry about it.
And then Richard Dooley of the Arlington Initiative for Reimagining Energy. So like Shady said, please hold your questions until the end. We will be having a Q&A though. And then also I want to give a huge shout out to Lost City Books and Shady for coordinating this, as well as our event coordinators. So Tim Lammers, who helped plan this, as well as Practice Free Lisa, our coordinator, Elena Paredes, our graphic designer, Isa Izquierdo. And so I'm going to hand it off to Catherine Christopher to start the panel. Let's put this down.
Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you very much, Shady, for having us here. I should also mention that Anne deserves a huge thank you for all of the work that she has put into this panel. As Anne said, my name is Catherine Christopher, and I'm the current chairperson and one of the founding members of Climate Classes. I can think of no better way to spend this Thursday evening than in conversation with our panelists, especially after a 70-degree day yesterday in February. Before we get started with the panel, I did want to give a brief introduction of each of our panelists and their organizations. So I will also start at this end of the table with Selma Khalil. Selma Khalil is a member of Sunrise DC, which is the local branch of the Sunrise Movement. The Sunrise Movement is a youth-driven movement that is focused on combating climate change through the political process and job creation, among other initiatives. Next, I'll go to Sarah Kogel-Smucker, who is an environmental and climate attorney at the Office of the People's Council of the District of Columbia. The OPC is an independent agency of the District of Columbia government, which focuses on and advocates for consumers of natural gas, electric, and telephone services in Washington, DC. The office's mandate is to advocate the provision of quality utility service and equitable treatment at rates that are just, reasonable, and non-discriminatory to assist individual consumers in disputes with utility companies about billing or services, and finally, to provide technical assistance and consumer education to lay advocates and community groups. Jen Hatch is a climate program analyst at the District of Columbia Department of Energy and Environment. The DOEE is the district's leading authority on energy and environmental issues, and among other things, is responsible for issuing permits, monitoring environmental conditions, providing funding and technical assistance, assessing environmental risks, developing policies, inspecting facilities, enforcing environmental regulations, working with other entities to solve everyday environmental issues, and informing and educating the public on local environmental trends and their benefits. And finally, last but not least, Rich Dooley is an AIR program manager in the Arlington County government. The Arlington Initiative to Rethink Energy, or AIR, manages and enacts Arlington's progressive energy plan through its residential, commercial, electric vehicle, and green building incentives programs. Thank you to all of our panelists for being here. Now, without further delay, let's start the discussion. So I'm going to start it off with a bit of a softball question, and I'd like to have all of the panelists jump in on this. But what are some of the expected impacts of climate change in the DC region?
Sure.
You can take the hot mic first.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Glad to see everybody out here tonight. I'll start out by talking about the urban heat island effect. So you may notice if you watch the news and you see the maps, when the weather person gets up there, they'll show that it's, let's say, 80 in DC, but it's 70 out in Winchester. And that's a common occurrence that happens during the spring and summer months. You'll notice it at least a 10-degree difference between that rural area and where we live here. That's because of the sun's rays hitting the buildings and the blacktop here, and then radiating off into the atmosphere. And it's also collecting closer to the ground and staying with us longer than it does out in the rural areas. And that's where the trees and the grasses are able to go ahead and get rid of that heat. So with climate change, we're going to see more of the urban heat island effect is what I'm foreseeing. And that's going to put increased demands on the electrical grids. And with that, we're going to have more air conditioning. So it's sort of a cascading effect that we're going to be seeing throughout as we progress and climate change becomes more and more of an impact. That cascading effect will then potentially cause brownouts and blackouts in that electrical grid, right at the same time when we need the electrical grid to be operational for air conditioning. So it's kind of ironic what we're seeing. Quick factoid, studies have shown that if it's 90 degrees compared to 80 degrees, that'll put another 20 to 25% greater impact on the grid, or we need 20 to 25% more power from the grid with that 90-degree day as opposed to an 80-degree day. So with climate change, we get the higher temperatures, more demand on the grid, and so forth. So that's some thoughts on the impacts.
Okay. Thank you for doing Urban Heat Island. I appreciate that. So in DC, the way we talk about climate impacts is that it's making the city warmer, wetter, and wilder. So Rich hit the warmer. And within DC, we even see a really big difference. We'll see almost a 17-degree difference between different parts of the city on an extreme heat day, which essentially means that some people are having a heat emergency and some people are not. So the solution, it really kind of brings home the need for solutions that are community level, because people are being impacted so differently, even just by air temperature here. But for us, we talk a lot about the wetter and the wilder too. And so the wetter for us is really two things. One is much more intense, heavy rain events. So just dropping a ton of water in a really short amount of time. If folks were here in September 2020, I remember this because it was my birthday and it just downpoured. It dropped like 2 to 6 inches within a couple of hours. And there was a lot of flooding of streets and roads, but also a lot of backups in people's basements and sewers, especially in like the Bloomingdale, Detroit Park area. Wetter, we're also, the tides are coming for us too. DC is on 2 tidal rivers and we have seen both of those rise at the same time that we're seeing subsidence. So we're having more what we call like sunny day flooding, where it's not flooding because it's raining down on us, it's flooding because it's coming up from the river. And then on the wilder, we're seeing more fast and quick moving storms, the energized by hotter air and water in the Atlantic. So if folks were here way back in 2012, our favorite example is a derecho that came through here, which basically super high winds knocked out a bunch of power. And then we had a heat wave immediately after. So you have a lot of people without power and therefore also without air conditioning right after. So unfortunately, we're looking for the intensity and frequency of all those to increase with climate. But that's why we're all here.
Thank you. That was an excellent overview and gave all the facts. The two things that I wanted to add is the urban heat island effect is a very important component of climate change, and it isn't random. It reflects the disparities in the city, both racial and economic. And there's a mapping done of the city where you can look at the map of socioeconomic conditions and temperature, and they overlay pretty significantly. And that's common in a lot of cities, but that's a reflection of policies, right? So policies have made certain areas greener, certain areas less industrial, and have areas that have the conditions to have the temperature down. So that's an important component of the heat island effect. And then one other thing that I always like to say about climate change effects is that you know it, you felt it. So it's useful to hear the facts, and they're very important and compelling. But one thing that I always like to say was, when I was a kid, I remember that anything over 85 was considered hot. I just remember like we would be like, "Ooh, it's 90 degrees out." I grew up in New York City, and there is no way anybody in New York City notes whether, a 90-degree day anymore as something remarkable or a thing. So I think you can also talk to friends and family and think about your own experience and think about how much hotter, wetter, and wilder it's getting.
Thank you very much, Rich, Sarah, and Jen. I want to follow up a little bit, Sarah, on the question that you had asked. We're going to get to that in just a minute. But Rich and Jen, as people who are working in the government space, we've talked about some pretty intense effects with the flooding and with the heat. And so my next question is just, how does that affect the populations of Arlington and the district? Specifically, how are people being affected by these weather events?
Lots of ways. I think I'll let Rich speak more to the energy side, because I think that's a little more your wheelhouse than mine. But one thing that we, especially in the last couple of years, given everything that's happening, we're having so many more conversations about what's the connection between climate and health. And knowing that we're starting from a place in the district where we already have known and stark health disparities in outcomes. Our Office of Health Equity has done an amazing job of quantifying just what Sarah was pointing out, that there are dramatic differences across the city in people's life expectancy, in asthma rates, in access to quality foods and education. And it shows up in vulnerabilities to climate change. So I think, people are impacted by having their power go out, not being able to run their air, to afford to run their air conditioning, or not having access to air conditioning at home when it's hot. People who, there's a whole group of folks that we're working with in Ward 7 who are all in the floodplain. So it impacts people in different ways, but I think the common thread there is that there are those overlapping characteristics that make people, exposure is one thing. Some of those are geographic, like how the city is built, who's closer to water, who lives in the, some features of what makes DC hot, but so many more factors really speak to the vulnerability of people and their ability to adapt to climate change. And that is really sort of at the crux of all of this. So whether that's race or income or employment level or underlying health, that is really what we're looking at and has been a really big focus driving our work forward.
See what I can do. So I will follow up on what Jen had mentioned before about some of the rainfalls that do accompany climate change or global warming. So with global warming, higher and hotter weather provides more latent heat. There's more moisture in the air, more power to thunderstorms, hurricanes, severe weather in general. And so because of that, an example that I'll bring up is across the river on July, where's the date? July 8, 2019 in Arlington. I remember the morning well. I was in a car driving and all of a sudden the rains came. They came down at about 7 to 9 inches per hour. It was an intense rainfall. It was very quick, very fast moving. But what it did is it led to an overwhelming of the storm sewer, the pipes that we have to convey the water and get the water off the streets and so forth. That system was overwhelmed, as well as the streams went over their banks. And so the water's got to go somewhere. Where it went was into basements, filled up basements, like a bathtub would be filled up houses. And so the impact, to your question, is it really impacts people who are business owners, homeowners, because with those intense storms that come out of nowhere, they lead to flash flooding, riverine flooding, as we call it sometimes in the urban setting. And because of that, you have long-term damage to those homes, those businesses, putting people out of their homes. Sometimes the homes can't be insured after the fact. We can talk a little bit about that. That happens even in Arlington, but also along coastal areas that are impacted by it. And so these are things that we're going to see more and more of, and the insurance industry is waking up to it, and they're charging higher rates, as well as not insuring some places that are prone to these sorts of damage due to global warming and climate change.
So Sarah and Selma, I want to circle back a little bit more on specific communities that are being hit harder and other communities that are being shielded by privilege from the effects of climate change. So Sarah, I just want to circle a little bit back to what you started talking about and ask the question, are there specific communities that are more at risk because of climate change, and are there communities that are less at risk? Selma, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, so there's risk to the actual effects, right? Are you in a flood zone? Are you in an area that has more extreme heat? There's a number of studies that show in the district that largely maps with social and economic and racial disparities, and so tracks wards, largely wards 8, 7, 6, 4 are more vulnerable. but it can drill down. Our office did a study on equitable electrification district where we mapped some of these disparities, and that showed, even within wards, there's more vulnerable populations in certain areas. But then there's also the social vulnerability, and the district's done a fantastic job documenting a lot of that. But, as is talking about, if you can afford to get a contractor in before you qualify for the government program, if there's flooding in your basement, or if you can afford to run your air conditioner extreme heat, as was mentioned. So, having the resources, our office works a lot on utility affordability, and we see that as a resilience issue, because if you can't afford to run your air conditioner, if you can't afford to run your heat, if you don't have any leeway in your budget to bounce back after extreme events, if you can't afford to, miss a day's pay due to a disruption where you can't get to work, it is much harder to be resilient to a more extreme climate and more climate disruption. So we see affordability as a component of that social resiliency, as does the district, and has they documented very well.
Oops. Thank you. Yeah, I think I definitely agree, and I would maybe zoom out a little bit and say that our environment, right, is very inseparable from the world that we operate in. So crises of our climate operate and come as a backdrop to just about everything. Resulting disasters only exacerbate the systemic issues that are already present in our communities and our societies, and that many marginalized people already experience to very high event. And I'm thinking here, right, of Black and Indigenous communities, of queer communities, and particularly trans and gender non-conforming folk, of undocumented communities who don't have access, right, to the same levels of healthcare, of air quality, food quality, protection against hazardous material, or even the tools for redress or the wealth to access this redress that other more privileged people in our districts, our city do. And I say all this to say that we again view climate justice as being a deeply intersectional issue for that case, and that part of fighting for climate justice is also thinking about and really undoing and unwinding oppressive systems, and systems that have been built on and imbued by oppressive dynamics like anti-Blackness and xenophobia and Islamophobia, etc. And we see that effort as being part of creating climate resilience, and maybe even more importantly, part of honoring really the vision that environmental justice has for the communities that we want to live in.
Thank you so much. Before we go a little bit further into the solutions, because right now we're kind of in the process of bumming everyone out, I wanted to just take one more step a little bit further into this discussion about the history and how we ended up with these disparities so certain communities are less climate resilient. I want to open this up to all of the panelists.
Okay. I don't know. I was actually should have looked at Sarah on this one. I think it is a lot of how, if you look at how the district has grown and the history of everything from redlining and how the communities have changed in the city, I think a lot of that has to do with it. I think one of the communities that just where things are sited, where our trash facilities are. I live in a neighborhood where DC's former landfill was. That's all east of the river. It still is all east of the river. And I think that legacy of how the city has kind of pushed people within the city and now outside of the city is really sort of that legacy that we're living with, so that the folks who are living closest to the rivers, closest to the former industrial sites, the power plants that have thankfully now closed in the district, but the legacy is still there. That I think tells us a lot about sort of the underlying environmental justice concerns, and then those also are as Sarah's saying, it's kind of the overlap between both exposure to the climate impacts, but also just concentration of populations who are more vulnerable. I guess.
Yeah, Just one thing I would add is if you look at redlining maps of the district, it's there are some areas that are the relatively privileged areas that weren't redlined. And for anyone who doesn't know, redline was a historic federal policy that didn't subsidize loans to people of color in certain areas, so drew maps and then effectively segregated those areas. And so it's not, it really depends on the history of each neighborhood, and I'm certainly no expert on it, but I have tried to look at those redlining maps and keep them in mind, and they certainly overlap with a lot of the disparities. It's just one factor, but it is, I think, a really significant one to understand that, you know, that people by government policies were kept out of neighborhoods that are now closest to Rock Creek Park and coolest and breeziest and less prone to flooding.
And following the thread of once the storms come, if they displace people because of power outages that are extended over days into weeks, or the rains push people out of their homes and so forth. In Arlington, there's fairly affluent areas, and people who have the means to go ahead and to deal with those issues will simply go ahead and rent a hotel room and won't even think twice about it, as opposed to some of disadvantaged communities and others who are really struggling to get by. It makes a big difference to them if their refrigerator or their freezer, everything in it goes to spoil, right? It matters as to where they're going to be living during this time when there's no electricity, there's no heating or cooling, depending on if it's winter or summer, and so forth. And so how they're going to deal with things, we really have to be making sure we don't have the haves and the have-nots when it comes to dealing with energy issues and climate change and global warming. And so that's what energy equity means to Arlington. And we're just starting off. DC is well ahead of us. We're going to learn from them, but that's what we have to go ahead and address as we move forward with implementing our community energy plan.
So Rich, I'm going to immediately toss it back to you, because before we get into the solutions part of this discussion, I wanted to note the important distinction of climate policy decisions, which is the difference between adaptation and mitigation. Would you mind defining these two terms and giving some examples of the types of policy that they entail?
I will do my best and then look to others on the panel to go ahead and support or correct me. So with mitigation and adaptation, those are words that are thrown out there often in the public press when they talk about climate change and what we're to do with it, right? So let's, one of the biggest challenges as we implement our community energy plan is getting on a common ground and common language. So when we were talking before the panel got together, I talked about that issue and making things relevant and understandable to just the general populace. With that as backdrop, mitigation is simply saying we want to lessen the likelihood that either climate change is going to be occurring or lessen the severity of it through various measures. Saying that we don't want the catastrophic things to happen to us, whether it's hurricanes or all the things we've been talking about tonight. We want those things to stay away as much as possible. So mitigation measures, some examples of that would be increasing energy efficiency of this building, of our homes, and so forth. And so reducing the demand that we have on the energy grid and on our energy needs. Energy efficiency is number one, right? And then we also go ahead and use renewable energy to lessen our need for fossil fuels, because as you burn fossil fuels, you add to greenhouse gas emissions, which furthers the climate change and global warming. And so those are a couple of examples of mitigation measures. Adaptation is simply saying what we've been talking about all along, climate change is here, right? And so we need to go ahead and to do our best to try to adapt to it, recognize that it is happening, and do our best to go ahead and to deal with all the things, the severe storms and severe weather events that we've been talking about. And so with adaptation, we talk about some examples such as making sure we do resiliency and backup power generators for our energy grid and for critical facilities, to make sure we have continuity of operations for our critical hospitals and other facilities that people rely on. If we have food, heating and cooling centers, making sure that those can be back up and running as quickly as possible in a large spread power outage. Also, some communities are adding seawalls. I know that's happening in Alexandria in particular, but other areas are adding seawalls, recognizing the rising waters due to climate change. And so I'm going to stop right there and leave it to the rest. But adaptation, mitigation, let's get it straight as to what it is and what we're trying to do with all these things.
Did anyone else want to talk about adaptation or mitigation?
That's a great summary.
Yeah, I was just gonna let him drop the mic.
I was hoping for point counterpoint, but that's okay.
Well, in this case, then we will go on to what Arlington and also what the district is doing in the programs that they're starting to run to combat climate change, both physically and then also make sure that their solutions are equitable.
Sure. Yeah, and so I do want to also give full credit to my team. I am more on the mitigation side. That's really my primary role at DOE. I've been leading our kind of plan to 2050. How do we become carbon neutral by 2050? But I'm filling in for some great coworkers who are more on this adaptation side. And I think I think we have to work on all fronts. Like, all of these things are happening, so they're all priorities. But I think one of the things that we've been working on, in particularly recent, or I guess for the last few years, is this concept of, another word for adaptation. We talk a lot about resilience, or preparedness is another good word for this. And we've been trying to think about, what does it mean for communities to be prepared? Not just individuals, like some of us have your go bag, not me, I'm not that organized, but what does it look like for a community to bounce back after some disaster? And so one of the things that we have set forth in, we have a plan called Resilient, DC, aptly named. There's a goal in there for every member of the community at some point to have a place, a resilience hub that they can go to in the event of one of these disasters. And so we've started a project with a group in Ward 7, so upper northeast, in the Watts Branch neighborhood, which is particularly prone to flooding, and took it to the community of, like, climate change is here, it's happening. What are the kinds of things that need to happen in this neighborhood, and where would you like to start? And they actually wanted to start with a resilience hub, having a dedicated community space that could, basically offer a place that would be online with power in the event of an emergency, but also in the normal operations, which is what you hope they're operating under most of the time, be a community space, a place that people turn to naturally, that's open and accessible and owned by the community, so that when you have a disaster, it is already a natural space. People feel comfortable there, and you can go there for resources, whether it's putting your insulin in the fridge, plugging in your charger, or figuring out what are those other resources. So we've been working with this group of community leaders for more than 3 years to figure out what are the services that should be provided in a community, and by whom. What building should actually be the resilience hub? Like, what building should we put solar and battery on? And what kind of programming do we need to make this a community resource? And I think that is sort of at the crux of the larger conversation we have to have all over the city of, what does the community need? What's already there and what's missing? And how can we start to fill in those gaps so that we can kind of adapt to whatever the disaster is that we're facing? So I think that's one of the most exciting things that we're doing, and the work that we're really, really proud of.
So in 2010, our county board chair at the time asked staff to go ahead and work with a consultant to develop what was called a community energy plan in Arlington. It was adopted by our county board in June of 2013, and then it was updated about 5 years later. We're planning on updating it every 5 years because the energy sector is just so quick so fast moving, so dynamic that we want to make sure our plan is relevant to the current market conditions. So that was updated in September of 2019. The overarching principles regarding the community energy plan is to make sure that we stay economically competitive. And this is in no particular order. They're all kind of on an even playing field. Making sure we have energy security, making sure we're true to our word about environmental commitment. And then in 2019, the county board said, you forgot something, energy equity. And so we have a fourth lens through which we look at the community energy plan and its implementation by making sure, once again, that we're doing it in an equitable fashion. We've broken it down into different goal areas. So there's buildings, there's clean transportation or decarbonization of transportation, there's renewable energy, there's also county government activities, and then there's also education. And so there's a number of different things to tackle there. Never a dull moment. It looks up to the year 2050, where Arlington has said we want to be carbon neutral by the year 2050. And so we have a roadmap that we are going ahead and implementing a variety of different programs to try to ensure that we don't miss any of the things that deal with distribution of energy, generation, use, and storage of that energy on into the out years, but recognizing we need to get things done today. We can't wait until 2030, 40, and those milestones. It has to happen actually yesterday. So that keeps me up at night, keeps me busy. And to echo what Jen had mentioned, we have a team over in Arlington, dedicated, passionate professionals who are tackling this as part of the AIR program. And it's important to also note that we work together across our departments. There's a little over 3,600 employees in Arlington for Arlington County government. Part of my role is to ensure that the ethos and the elements of the community energy plan are woven into everyday activities of each of those employees to make them ambassadors, if you will, for that community energy plan. So they're able to do the things that they do. Department of Human Services, as they're out meeting with clients, how can they help their clients deal with the climate change, and how can they do the work that they do as part of the community energy plan? So anyways, that's all we do in Arlington.
So I'd like to direct this next question to Sarah and Selma and take a little bit of a step back from the plans being implemented by two different government groups. Climate change is a big problem that can be and often is tackled through many channels. So can you tell us how your offices and organizations are engaging with government agencies, other organizations, or sectors in working to implement climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts?
Sure. So as I said, I've worked for the Office of the People's Council. We represent many of you if you pay an electric bill, a gas bill, or a water bill. And we're representing your interests before district government. A lot of my work is at the Public Service Commission, which is the entity that regulates the provision of electric and gas service in the district. And so they oversee the district's regulated utilities. For electric, that's PEPCO, and for gas, that's WGL. And climate change is becoming more and more a center of issues at the Public Service Commission, because the decision isn't just, do we need a new substation here or should it be there? The decision is, how is the district's electric gas sector is going to be transformed to support and meet the district's carbon goals of, getting there to 50% reduction by 2032 and net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So I advocate representing the People's Council with Sandra Madabu-Fry, and she's very passionate that we need to meet these goals. It's an existential issue, but we need to do it in a way that is safe, affordable, just, equitable, and reliable. And so a lot of what we are doing, both at the Public Service Commission district agency, is also we have a colleague of mine works full-time on regional markets and FERC issues, because there's so many federal issues affecting district consumers. All of these decisions are going to affect your electric bill, your electric mix, and your gas bill, your gas mix, and how it's going to be transformed. And so, we have very detailed advocacy in specific proceedings. And one just to highlight that I work a lot on right now is there's a proceeding where the commission has asked the district's utilities, PEPCO and WGL, to provide their plans and the backup data and information on how they're going to support the district's climate goals. So how they are going to transform their business plans to support the district's climate goals. And we are heavily involved in making sure that these plans are actionable, that they're real, that they are affordable, that they're just, and that we're not wasting money where we're doing something, spending, ratepayers' money that isn't in support of the goals, isn't moving us along in the right direction, or is moving us along in a direction that isn't as affordable as possible.
I think that there are many ways in which Sunrise DC and like general organizing groups operate as connective tissues between the government and the rest of our communities. And those can look like different things, right? Like collaborating with council members or ANCs and helping refine legislative language. But I think something that I would like to speak a little bit to is the type of collaboration that mutual aid work in particular invites us to do. And just to take a second to read this definition that I did not memorize by Dean Spade, which says that mutual aid is the collective coordination to meet each other's needs, usually from an awareness that the systems we have in place are not going to meet them. And to concretize this a little bit more, some of our mutual aid work involves a lot of COVID-19 relief work, such as mass distribution, test distribution, vaccine registration and outreach in various wards like Ward 4, 5, 7, and 8. And these have always happened in very deep partnership and collaboration with community leaders. And I think it is very important whenever we talk about how to help or support or uplift a specific community's needs to make sure that it's a relationship that's really built on trust and one that is responsive and not prescriptive to their needs.
Thank you very much for that. Before talking about considerations for climate justice and equity, we do want to note that the DC region, like many regions in the United States, has a history of redlining, like we discussed earlier, gentrification, displacement, and environmental racism. Selma, could you tell us a little bit more about how this drives the agenda that you just started talking about?
Yes, and there are many people much more qualified than me that can talk about DC's history, right, with environmental injustice and racism and the response to all of these different things. But I think, again, to what I was saying in trying to be responsive and not prescriptive, it's important to understand like the history of the community that we operate in, as well as where it stands today. And the reality is that there are environmental injustices ongoing in the city and that they do not map out equally across the district. Many studies have shown that wards 5, 7, and 8, which are predominantly Black, experience higher levels of exposure to hazardous materials and pollutants. And so in thinking about how to engage in environmental justice, it's really important to keep in mind, right? Looking at Ward 5 specifically, there's a really large number of industrial sites, highways have been built over neighborhoods. And so I'm trying to think about like where we can have the greatest support and impact. It's important to, again, like keep this in mind. And one of our projects that tries to be responsive to that is our Justice for Brentwood project, where we're working with, again, neighborhood communities and community leaders and other policy groups to stop the city from building a bus transfer facility that would be highly disruptive and involve a lot of really negative effects in the community itself. And then you mentioned also gentrification and displacement. The district is a space that has experienced really high levels of gentrification and with a lot of displacement. And so a lot of our work also involves housing justice work and eviction defense work, to keep that in mind too.
I keep worrying I'm going to knock over this water and just electrocute everyone in the front row, including myself, which would make this panel a little different from how we've originally planned it. Selma, I just want to stay with you for one more question after that interlude. My apologies. Something that I also thought was very interesting as I was doing some research on the Sunrise movement are some of the other initiatives. I think a lot of times when we think of, climate change, we automatically think of the adaptation and mitigation measures that we have already started discussing this evening. But you have mentioned some of the other sorts of projects, and I noticed that some of them have to do with voting registration, but also with policing. And I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about how these things also go into the broader climate agenda for everyone.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think something that we really believe in, again, is that climate justice is a deeply intersectional issue. And that's because the climate crisis maps out on the cracks that are already ever present in our society. And housing justice was just like a facet that I mentioned in, right? Like we have unhoused communities, people who are facing evictions and who are going to lose one of the biggest forms of protection against the element, i.e. shelter or housing. And another way that we see this intersectional issue mapping out is in terms of policing and abolition work. And part of our reasoning in this is that we are very conscious that BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, communities, and particularly Black communities, are overburdened by policing and police brutality, and that it is also a very significant problem in the city. And of course, there are direct impacts that police presence can have on an environment, right? We're talking about air pollution, noise pollution, we're talking about restriction of movement and access to green spaces. There's also definitely like an acute stressor component to this, right? Having over policing in public spaces and schools and recreational spaces, being something that can definitely exacerbate a lot of mental health and like different like emotional aspects of your well-being. And then there's also the reality that climate justice really calls for a safe and sustainable community. And I think part of honoring that mandate, right, is understanding that removing systems that have caused repeated and extreme harm to certain communities is really important in honoring the type of society that I think environmental justice calls for. And in terms of democracy work and voting rights work, we also believe that responding to the climate crisis, both in its discrete terms as well as the broader intersectional one that I'm proposing, requires a government that is ultimately responsive and representative of its constituents. And again, not everyone has the same level of voting literacy and access to the ballot, and trying to mitigate that is really important.
Thanks so much. So on the topic, and I'm going to open it back up to all of our panelists, on the topic of climate justice and equity, how can DC and Arlington ensure best practices that address the climate crisis and protect the most vulnerable members of our community? And as a secondary question, where should the most resources be diverted to maximize these outcomes?
Well, I will start off by saying that Arlington is very much at its beginning or nascent stage when it comes to addressing energy equity. So again, we do want to learn from those who have come before us and gone before us with DC and others who have done some really great work in this regard. That said, number one, I think reaching out to a variety of different community members and as well as organizations to hear from them what their needs are, because I don't want to go in assuming I know what you need and start developing programs and so forth. So put my listening hat on and really listening to a variety of different organizations and individuals in our community to try to better understand what those needs are, I think is our first step. One of the things that I know has helped in other jurisdictions is developing incentive programs that help to narrow the distance between a very energy efficient piece of equipment, let's say a furnace or an air conditioner, that can help reduce the operating costs and the cost for monthly utility bills for people of all socioeconomic groups. But those pieces of equipment cost a bit more than what we would call contractor grade or the really basic furnace or air conditioner that can be had out there. And so we want to see the higher level, higher performing sort of equipment out there. But in order to make that happen, how do we go about developing income-based incentive programs that allow for people, particularly in disadvantaged communities, to enable them to purchase that equipment and narrow that cost so that it's on par cost-wise in the initial purchase of that equipment with just your basic equipment. So developing those sort of programs, incentive programs, and making them income-based, I think is going to be something that we really want to dive into. Also, education and making sure that people know when they have to make these decisions about replacing equipment, they have at their fingertips the information, the knowledge, the questions to ask of contractors and of retailers and so forth about equipment, and making sure they're knowledgeable about this, because it can get really technical very quickly. If I say something like the average fuel utilization efficiency, you may look at me and kind of, walk away, but that is an important element on how furnaces are deemed efficient or not efficient. So you want to talk with a contractor and you say, I want a furnace with an AFUE no worse than blah. Your contractor will take you seriously. And then also you'll go ahead and you'll say, I want that because I want better operating efficiencies. Anyways, that sort of information doesn't come readily to the average person. And it's my job to take that technical, really in the weeds sort of information, make it understandable, palatable, and accessible to the average person so that you can make them dangerous when they need it, when their furnace breaks down and they need it right then and there.
I think I would echo you on the, we're really used to paying like technical experts to do technical modeling and, and solving engineering problems. And I think the thing that we are trying to get better at, and we haven't nailed it for sure, but we're trying, is thinking about the community and individual residents as the experts on their own lived experience. And how do we value that in the same way that we value kind of technical consultants? Some of the work that I was doing on my own work in developing our strategy for 2050 was really going to do a series of sort of, you could think of them like community focused groups. And rather than leading with climate, which is a target, it's not a vision, really just digging into what are the things that are most challenging. What do you want from a city that you want to live in or your grandkids to live in 2050? What are the things that are standing in our way, and what do we have to solve or change in order to get there? And then how do I attach my climate ornament to those things? And it's not surprising. It's health, it's housing, it was affordability. Those are the key things. And we got to a point of how can we advance those things through the changes that we know have to happen in our homes and buildings, in our transportation system, in how we think about and deal with waste. And so I think for us really to center community in the work requires going to them from the beginning, as we've all said, and I think Selma put it so beautifully, and starting there and figuring out where are the synergies that we can have and how are we, I think there's a framework that we use a lot for a racial equity analysis. How do we advance opportunity and how do we reduce harm? And having that as like our central framework as we're thinking about the work that we're doing. And then you asked a second question of like, where should we put the most research? And I'm totally going to punt on that one because it's all of the things. But I will say that housing for us is such a critical problem. And I think housing is a really interesting intersection of all the things that we're working on. Especially during the pandemic, we found that people felt conceptually most safe in their home, but actually it's not a huge shock for many low-income residents that their home is not actually a safe and healthy place to be. And so with that opportunity, with all the things that have to change in our built environment, how can we make all those things possible? And I think for me, that is something that I'm really excited about. Do you want to take a second? Okay.
Good.
So a couple of things from the consumer's perspective. One is that we advocate for a very thoughtful look at funding sources for these programs. So I think energy efficiency is a great example. It's really important. It's incredibly useful. It is funded by ratepayers. And so when you have an energy efficiency program that is a surcharge on your bill, and it can be money well spent, but we want it to be spent incredibly efficiently. And also, energy efficiency programs are going to come out of bills, but a lot of these programs, they could come out of taxes, they could come out of federal funding, they could come out of utility funding. And in the district, we're really lucky from my personal perspective that taxes are progressive in the district. So the percentage tax burden is higher as your higher income, it's lower as your lower income. Utility bills are exactly the opposite. They're regressive, right? Everybody pays the same amount for electricity, and that becomes a higher percentage of your household budget. And so we did an energy affordability study that found that the average energy burden for low and moderate income households is 7.8%. Energy burden is what percentage of your household budget you spend on utilities, compared to 1.2% for non-LMI. And then SNAP eligible, that's the lowest bracket of households, have an average energy burden of 20.5%. So you're having a very high, and that's sort of intuitive, people spend, as you have less money, you're spending way too much on utilities. But so we have been advocating for a very thoughtful approach for, should this climate solution come out of utility bills, or should it come out of taxes, or should we try to maximize federal funding first, or should shareholders have to contribute to it, or can we find grant funding for it? But that the funding source is a very important starting point, and that the community should be brought into the conversation, just as the community is being brought into the conversation for solutions, the community should be brought into the conversation for funding. And then another specific thing is, you can't make equitable what you don't know the situation is. And so we've been advocating a lot for, in programs, to track racial, economic, and geographic distribution. So again, energy efficiency programs are a great example. These are fantastic programs, but as they're being implemented, they should be tracked, who's benefiting, and then adjustments should be made to the program if it is showing that it's not, that there's some inequity in the who's benefiting or who's participating. And then lastly, I'll say, as a solution, a lot of climate solutions also can solve other problems. So I think transportation electrification is a great example where it's a climate solution, but it's also a clean air solution. And so we've been advocating to prioritize rollout of transportation electrification solutions and funding that's funded either by ratepayers in communities that are already overburdened by air pollution. So the more that we can look to have climate solutions also help solve other problems that benefits everyone.
I think this is a really important question and a really big one too, right? Again, back to the point about how are we responsive and not prescriptive, right? And how do we allocate our resources and capacity and thinking in the right way? And I think everyone else here has said it so beautifully, right? A big part of it is making sure that you are in touch with and in community with the people that you are hoping to support and have an impact with and on. And I think the way that we have grappled with this is exactly trying to continuously investigate, where is there a need and how can we fill it, and what is our, with full humility, what do we actually bring to the spaces that we're in. And again, just to map out on the previous issues that I mentioned, right, we talk about how housing is so important and intersects at so many different really important issues. So much of our work is around eviction defense for various residents of the district, including those who are unhoused. And that is specifically because we're during a global pandemic where there's a lot of financial hardship. And so meeting rent is really difficult. We're also coming out of hypothermia season where being unhoused and not having a shelter is often fatal, right? And and we're also coming at a time where the city is having an increased numbers of evictions of encampments too. And so this is where we've decided to focus our efforts in this issue area. And again, looking at our abolition work, we work with community groups such as Defund MPD to push for legislation that would reallocate funds for what the community actually needs, right? Which is employment stimulation programs, which is violence interruption programs and health services. And in terms of democracy and voting right, we're coming up in an election season, and so much of our work is about increasing the threshold, right, to access to the ballot, as well as, decreasing the threshold to access the ballot, do not want to make it harder, and increasing literacy around this. And so it's looked like get out the votes events, distributing voter registration information, hosting town halls so that people can make an informed decision about their vote. And obviously an informed decision about what kind of different climate and environmental justice policies would be set in place in the future.
I want to be mindful of time because I realize that we've been having a very stimulating conversation now for almost a full hour. But before I turn it over for just a couple of questions, and then of course, the main event, the reception afterwards, I wanted to quickly pick each of your brains on how everyone in this room can continue this discussion and how people can, if they so choose, get more involved. Either maybe directly with some of the programs and initiatives that any of you have discussed throughout the course of the evening, or if you just have general advice for people becoming more involved in this issue. So I will start this time at this end with Salma, and then we'll work our way down to Rich.
Also a great question. Again, for full transparency, I'm only 25 years old. I do not know half of what the people at this table know, right? And I think that my point in trying to say this is that like the bar to getting involved is really low. Like anyone can do even a small amount towards this general fight. And it is not a non-binary issue, right? It's not all or nothing. Like any little step is important and is valuable. And that's my spiel to like, you guys can get involved. Don't feel pressed that you don't know that much. It's like really not that deep, and it's also not that hard. And in terms of ways that like I think are important to get involved, a big one is learning, right? Like, as I said, climate justice is an intersectional issue, and any one person will have blind spots as to how it like is perpetuated, who it impacts, how it impacts. And so a big part of this is making sure that you continuously learn and try to be up to date about like how this engages in your society and in your community. And to name one space that I really like to learn from, I think the Slow Factory is a wonderful online education space led by people of color that have very interesting and engaging conversations. If you're looking at intersectional community organizing groups here in the DC area, so NYCC is one of them, the Sierra Club is another one. And there are also a very large number of groups that are involved in housing justice and abolition work and transportation work. And if you're interested in any of them, please let me know and I'll be very happy to refer you.
So I'll talk to two things. One is bringing your voice into the decision making. And so, you know, we try to be consumers' voice at the Public Service Commission because a lot of this is technical. You often have to be a stakeholder and a party. But you can also just weigh in on decisions that are being made. One great thing about the district is, you know, the city council has hearings on bills. You can testify. You can just get emails. I think, you know, not endorsing a specific position, but Sierra Club gives a lot of great information about events. So does the DC Environmental Network. Our office tries to keep consumers informed about opportunities to weigh in on things. So we have a newsletter. We can follow us on Twitter, etc. So that's part of it is, and echo, you don't need to be an expert. That's not the value that you're adding. The value you're adding is making sure that it's not just a room of experts making the decision, it's hearing from community members. But then on some mitigation, so we try to be your liaison in accessing some district programs. So we have a advocate that does energy efficiency workshops. And if anybody, there's a short video on our website. If you go to OPC's website, you go to climate, you can click on an energy efficiency, but also if you have a, she does this full-time going to community organizations virtually and in person and just giving some really practical tips on energy efficiency. And then, you know, if you have a question about district programs related to gas, electric, water, or telephone, you can always call our office and just talk to one of our consumer representatives. And then we also have a advocate who helps connect people who do have the ability to do rooftop solar, either individually or through an institution. She does a lot of actually faith-based work with institutions, so helping religious institutions connect to solar programs and get involved in having clean energy in their institution. So if you're involved in an institution or individually want to help accessing potential programs for rooftop solar, you know, call our office, you know, get connected to the right person. But I think energy efficiency is low hanging fruit. I definitely could be way better at turning power strips off or vacuuming under my refrigerator regularly. So it's really useful to just hear some of those tips too. But it should not be on the individual. So it should also be something where you're weighing in on the decisions affecting the district's utilities.
I think I was yes and so all of that, and I think especially on the decision side, because I love that we have a sustainable DC as the district's like overarching sustainability plan, and it's great for no matter what door you'd like to come through. If it's volunteering, it's food, there's something there for everybody, but it's also sort of as our plans get updated, those things will appear in there too, so that I'll plug that little newsletter. But I think, you know, no matter what your issue is, like there are decisions, if you live in the district, there are decisions being made about things in your neighborhood all the time. And so I would say, again, the bar, you don't need to be the climate expert, but just raising the things that you want to see out of those projects, whether it is, you know, buses moving faster through the city or being able to reclaim off-street parking for, you know, bikes or streeteries or whatever it is. The more that we can hear from community members about what really matters, like you'd be surprised that it's really sometimes hard to drill down to that level for each of these project level things. And it really does matter because we have no problem hearing from technical experts. And I think we love being in this community. It's like an ecosystem with advocates. We all have our role. That's how it's supposed to work. But I think the more folks who feel empowered to take on that, you don't have to have an expert opinion, but just we can work with those nuggets of what people want to see, but we do have to hear it.
Show of hands, how many have heard of the game of life or played the game of life? Raise your hand. Okay. A healthy dose. That's great. We had what's called an energy journey that we did a few times in Arlington. And it was patterned after the game of life. And it allowed people to come in and, you know, get some imaginary money and then walk from table to table. And what the whole journey did was it helped people make a decision early on as to what they're going to live in. Are they going to live in a big mansion? Are they going to live in an apartment? Where are they going to live? Are they going to live close to Metro, or are they going to live way away from public transit and so forth? What kind of vehicle will they get, if any vehicle, and so forth? They made these decisions, and then later on in the game, they figured out what happened with those decisions they made earlier in the game. And so it was eye-opening to a lot of people. They said, you know, I didn't even realize by making that decision early on the impacts it would have later on. So we try to, as the best of our ability, allow people to understand how the community energy plan relates to them and how it's relevant to every person's everyday situation. So it's a constant battle that we have in trying to go ahead and do that. And I take it as a personal challenge to try and do that with each and every person. So that gets back to what you can do on a daily basis, right? Understanding decisions that you make. Walking to the store, biking to the store instead of jumping in the car and going there, right? Every little bit helps, and trying to set an example for others in your community, neighbors, and so on and so forth. Sharing those discussions with them as to why you made the choice that you did. The conversations that the other panelists have mentioned, I'll just simply echo, we rely on volunteers often when we run programs and so forth. And so getting those volunteers to raise their hand and say, yeah, I'll spend a couple of hours helping you with an event. That is fantastic. Also, we have commissions in Arlington and committees that you can go ahead and join to be part of the discussion, to be advocates, as well as to learn in those commissions and committees. There's also understanding when to have your voice most impactful. And so echoing what Sarah had mentioned and others on the panel had mentioned, with county board meetings, the county board members in Arlington, the 5-member group, if they hear from you during a county board meeting about a project, a large building going up, and you're saying it's not energy efficient enough, they're going to hear that, and they're going to understand that this is on people's minds. These are elected officials. They want to respond to those who are going to be pulling the lever at election time. So they're going to be responsive to this, and they're going to be beholden to you to show that they care and to show that they're doing the things that you want them to do. But as Jen said, you need to let them know what you want, right? So you need to be out there. You need to be forceful with your actions, letting people know this is what we demand, this is what we need, and this is what we want, and doing it at the right time. And so those county board meetings are a great way to go ahead and do that. And again, just be out there, let your voices be heard, and come to more classes like this. And hats off to Climate Classes DC for holding events like this, because this is where great information is shared, learned, and I learned tonight, as well as hopefully you did.
Do we have time for questions? No, we don't have, okay.
Maybe
Thank you all for coming to this presentation tonight. We really appreciated having you here. But the conversation, although we've run out of time for questions now, that doesn't mean that you can't ask questions. We're going to take a few minutes to do a little bit of rearranging, and we have some snacks and some drinks. And perhaps a few of the panelists will stay, maybe not. But if they're around, if you have questions, please continue to engage in the dialogue with them and with one another. Again, we are Climate Classes. We've put up a few QR codes. Please follow us on social media. We'll be having other events throughout the year. We look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much for your time.
I was gonna say, looking at that, I can't believe I said that.